Hey guys, it's Malthor here once again, and today I want to show you the build I've been working on beta, which is essentially going to be a nice starting character for the league, and it is Raider Frostblades. This is a non-crit character using either swords or claws, and really takes very little gear to get off the ground while completing all of the quest mode, and then getting into lower tier maps, while still having, I think, decent potential to upgrade into the end game once you put more currency and gear onto the type of character. So I do want to show you the character I'm currently playing, which is ragtag, almost no gear, and then a more endgame version, which I think involves Dreamfeathers or Touch of Anguish claws, either or, but I think Dreamfeathers are the more optimal situation. So you can see the character plays pretty smoothly. It's a very fast play style where you zip around with your whirling blades, and ultimately movement speed when you wear a Queen of the Forest, but initially whirling blades. And the goal here was to make it some sort of a decent replacement for the Dreamfeather Raider poison build that we have played and loved quite recently, whereas now it's just going to be Frostblades with pure conversion, pure cold damage. Still a very similar playstyle. You have a lot of evasion. You have something like 5 to 5,500 life. Play very quickly and have adequate damage to take on the end game. I haven't actually gotten to the end game yet with this character because it's on beta and I basically don't have any gear and I haven't invested much time into it, but looking at the path of building, it does look like it should scale well enough to be able to clear the entire end game, and it's something I'll probably be trying out when 3.0 actually hits live. But for now, it's just sort of a concept starter build. At least up until early maps, I can definitely recommend it, and I'll show you how to build it and what you need to know about Frostblade specifically, and this character and the gear that you're going to be aiming towards, because it starts out cheap, but it can get more expensive as you get into the end game. So currently the character you are looking at in those clips is only a level 80 Raider with whatever gear I could get on this character at the time. A few little bits and pieces that I did manage to buy, like a 5-link shark skin that I alked, just some life resists on rings for the most part. And it's very basic gear to begin with. The sword I'm using is actually not too bad. It's got something like 340 physical DPS, I think, but it's not very impressive to look at. And then I'm also using a claw with just some flat fizz and fast attack speed. So the build revolves around non-crit, meaning you just need any old weapon that has good attack speed and good physical damage, as well as that additional cold or weapon elemental damage is a bonus too. But mostly we're looking for flat fizz because the passive tree revolves very largely around scaling some decent physical here or there, and then converting it all to cold with weapon cold damage and winter spirit, and then of course Frostblades itself. So it's 100% cold damage, and it's all of your fizz getting converted into cold, which then gets scaled by your elemental damage here, 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 and of course the gem elemental damage here, cold penetration here or there, cold pen over here, and added cold over here as well. Ultimately, you build into a Dreamfeather, which then is roughly pretty similar to a sword like this, a bit less on the fizz, but it also scales that through evasion, which then also increases your added cold damage quite a lot more too. And overall, Dreamfeather should be, I think, the most solid sword for the build, except for, of course, Touch of Anguish. If you want to use 2 of those, they're currently pretty expensive and sought after, I think, especially on beta, and they'll have a little less damage than a dual Dreamfeather setup ultimately, but they will have the chain that you're looking for, which helps clear speed. So as always with every Frostblade character, I do feel the need to explain Frostblades a little bit. It does have an initial melee hit portion to it, and then a projectile splash behind it. So you attack with a melee hit, and whatever that melee hit hits, you will have projectiles behind it. So you scale damage through projectile damage strictly for the projectiles, or melee damage strictly for the melee hit, or you can go elemental damage or physical damage and scale both at once, which is what we're trying to do. So that's why you don't go out of your way to get any specific melee damage. For example, increased melee while holding a shield. That means that will only scale the initial hit and not the projectile afterwards. If you, for example, take Ballistic Mastery for projectile damage, it will only scale the projectiles behind it and not the initial melee hit. So you want something that scales both ideally. And that's why nodes like Elemental Damage, Frenzies, elemental damage with weapons, physical damage with weapons, physical damage, all of that is really good scaling, and of course attack speed and other things like that. The build is a raider so that you can get easy access to frenzy charges and many more frenzy charges to spec into, and then a lot of damage from there as well. And then you get Quartz Infusion and Avatar of the Veil, so you're immune to statuses, as well as having a bunch of extra elemental damage and some little bits of evasion there too. And of course we are using 2 jewels, Fight for Survival, which just increase the melee portion's penetration to cold, thus making killing rares and bosses a lot easier. So getting 2 of those is pretty important in the end game, but early on you don't really need them. It's just once you start getting to things that are more resistant heavy that you definitely need to pick some up. And currently my character has something like 40 to 50,000 tooltip completely buffed, with all frenzies and everything, and this is more of an endgame setup that I've put together on Path of Building, and we're looking at the melee hit having about 760,000 DPS, but that is with everything factored in. And a good thing about a build like this is it's not going to suffer too much against a Shaper, for example. So if the enemy is not a boss, it doesn't have any additional resistances or anything, you're doing 760,000 DPS. If you have a Shaper here, you're still doing almost all of your DPS because you're not getting most of it cut through durations and curse effectiveness and all that sort of stuff like Poison and Ignite builds often did suffer. So these types of builds are very strong for endgame, and the more gear you can throw at them, the faster they'll clear all this content because the damage just kinda stays fairly constant throughout the end game. But to show you specifically the end game setup, we have 2 Dreamfeather swords, and you do get attack damage per evasion rating. Now that will scale our current fizz, which then gets converted to cold, as well as scaling our added cold gem here. So it's a good 2-fold effect there, and in the end this current build has about 42,000 evasion, so close to 100% extra attack damage there. And besides that, there's not too much else to mention. Just the Star Conjures. Queen of the Forest doesn't have to be, can be any evasion chest, and ideally you're looking for some attack speed on gloves, some weapon early damage on belt down here, and then you probably want 2 steel rings or opal rings with a physical roll and an elemental damage roll as well. But if you can't get elemental damage, then cold damage is a really good roll as well, or as well as that, it can replace the physical. And likewise on the amulet, so cold, elemental, physical, all of those are really good and really what you're going to be looking for on your items. And then lastly, we do have the flasks. A Taste of Hate will go a really long way defensively and offensively, adds a good 50,000 DPS or so. Wise Oak, that's going to be for your penetration, so it's pretty damn important. And Lion's Roar, this does not affect the projectile portion of the skill, but it does affect the melee portion, and it's a huge multiplier for that. I think by the stage that you get to this level of DPS, you should have enough that you can afford to do things like scaling your melee hit, because you can see the melee hit now is 760, the Icy Blades is only 400. So this is the projectile portion down here. And the purpose of that is you're going to be a lot more worried about the single target and the melee hits against the heavier targets, because the splashback from the projectiles is still going to do plenty of damage behind it, and as well as that, it gets bonus from point blank, so they still do plenty of damage, basically catching up to the melee portion of the skill. And that's why by the end of the character you should start using melee physical damage. Initially I'm running cold penetration, I believe, but once you get into the end game, I think melee physical starts to overtake that, because cold penetration is really good until you get all of the cold pen on the tree, as well as the jewels and Wise Oak, and then you have enough cold penetration that you can probably ditch this guy and put in a melee fizz. Aside from that, we have elemental damage, multi-strike, Ellie focus, and added cold, I guess. As well as that, the bandit we have chosen is 2 passive points. Since the rest don't really do too much good stuff for us, I think that's the strongest one. In the end game, you may need Valpact as well, so bear that in mind. If you really need it, spec into it, but I think we should be okay on Reflect and surviving situations with all of our dodge, evasion, fortify without Valpact, but that's entirely up to you. The only other thing I'll mention is show node power over here. I've never really talked about it, but it does help if you want to see what's the best upgrade for your build at this point. The hotter or more red/yellow a node is, the more damage it's going to add to you, and more blue and purple is defensiveness. So you can see when you pan around, for example, that elemental overload is pretty damn huge for the build. If you get it in, it's an extra 30% damage, which is why it's so fiery or orangey, fiery hot over here. I'd say that's all I really need to say about the build for now. It will probably be included in the starter builds video, as I think it is a pretty decent starter. It leveled for me very smoothly with absolutely no gear, just whatever you can find as you find it, physical weapons, elemental weapons, whatever, on a solid 4-link of Frostblades, added cold, elemental damage, and then once you can, multi-strike, but until then, probably just faster attacks or so. Try to keep up Frostbomb on the enemies when you go for heavy single target, because as long as your Frostbomb is down, they have -20 cold resist under them, and as well as that, you can either use Ancestral Protector or Warchief as a friend of yours. Attach it in a 4-link, it'll do some damage, otherwise it's just there to buff you, and it does do a pretty damn good job of buffing you. Also running Hatred and Herald of Ice as our auras, though you could ditch Herald of Ice just for a Blasphemy with Frostbite, but for now I think Herald of Ice is fine, and I'll just be single target cursing with Frostbite. So that's Frostblade's Raider. I don't think there's really much more to say at this point. It's a good character, it's a good starter, and if you want to go for it, go right ahead. When 3.0 comes out, I think it should be a good one. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and see you next time.